A dark cloud has lingered over the legacy of one of the 20th century's preeminent thinkers. Martin Heidegger was arguably the most influential philosopher of the century. Indeed, his work remains hugely influential to this day in academia and beyond. Martin Heidegger was also a Nazi. Welcome to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. I'm Danny Postel, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. Recent years have seen the dramatic rise of right-wing authoritarian populist movements and parties across the world, including inside the democracies of Europe and North America. While many of these currents compete in elections, and sometimes win, it's become increasingly clear that their authoritarian agendas have put them on a collision course with democracy itself, even while they operate largely within democratic frameworks. Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party in Hungary perhaps most embody this dynamic, but it's playing out in multiple countries as reflected in a term like Orbanization, as in the much discussed Orbanization of the Republican Party in the United States. This authoritarian populist turn has an important intellectual genealogy. The key thinkers of the New Right, known as the Nouvelle Droite in France, the Neue Rechte in Germany, the so-called alt-right in the US also figures in this constellation, had been building the conceptual scaffolding for this project for decades. And it turns out that one of the key influences on several of those New Right thinkers was Martin Heidegger. Our guest on this episode, Richard Wolin, has a new book, Heidegger in Ruins, Between Philosophy and Ideology, in which, among other things, he traces this genealogy and illuminates the nature of Heidegger's influence on the New Right. Richard Wolin's relationship to these questions runs very deep. In the early 1990s, revelations about the extent of the German philosopher's Nazism and his efforts to conceal this chapter sparked a spirited debate that came to be known as the Heidegger Wars, which centered on whether there was a connection between Heidegger's political commitments and his philosophy. Heidegger's defenders insisted on a wall of separation between the two spheres. The critics argued that such a wall was untenable. Wolin was a key figure in those wars. His books, The Politics of Being, The Political Thought of Martin Heidegger, and The Heidegger Controversy, A Critical Reader, were at the center of the firestorm. The intellectual historian Martin Jay puts it succinctly. For 3 decades, Richard Wolin has battled strong headwinds to demonstrate the links between Heidegger's vile politics and his sublime philosophy. Wolin's latest effort shows that the winds have shifted and the mighty fortress built by Heidegger and his defenders has been blown away. Richard Wolin is Distinguished Professor of History, Political Science, and Comparative Literature at the City University of New York, or CUNY Graduate Center. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Danny, for your kind invitation to speak with you today.
Well, let's start, Richard, with the chapter of your book that you evocatively title From Beyond the Grave, in which you examine Heidegger's influence on contemporary far-right thinkers and even political parties. You write, the New Right, on both sides of the Atlantic, has made copious use of Heidegger's thought to advance its retrograde ethno-nationalist political agenda. In the course of the chapter, you go into various thinkers from France, Germany, Russia, and beyond, whose debt to Heidegger runs quite deep. Before we get into some of the specific cases, tell us broadly, if you could, what is the basic resonance of Heidegger's ideas for these far-right thinkers as a whole?
Yes, Heidegger was an arch critic of Western civilization, and along with that goes, of course, the heritage of the Enlightenment, liberal democracy, and at the time he was writing in the 1920s, prior to the advent of Hitler's dictatorship, his thought was implicitly directed against the liberal consensus, the democratic consensus of the Weimar Republic. In this respect, he shares commonalities with kindred spirits who are also being received and popularized by the far right in Europe, North America, etc. today, namely Carl Schmitt, Ernst Junger, Oswald Spengler, etc. They're known as the conservative revolutionaries. So, it's really not a stretch to begin with to see why Heidegger's rejection of enlightenment, individualism, reason, etc. Much of this is inherited from Nietzsche, or a certain political or metapolitical, let's say, reading of Nietzsche, which was very widespread among German right-wing intellectuals during the 1920s. So proceeding from this basis, and as you could tell by my chapter, which it surprised me, namely the extent to which Heidegger, who's on the one hand, his ideas, as you've insinuated, from the Martin J quote are very difficult. The entry level is demanding. Nevertheless, there's a popularized version of his theories that's extremely widespread today among far-right intellectuals. And it's not just high-flying intellectuals, as I try to explain in the book. It reaches and affects prominent think tanks in France, Germany, Austria, and elsewhere that are in league with authoritarian populist political parties today in Europe, and even during the Trump years. And we'll see in a couple of years if the Trump years are over or they re-begin, and in North America as well.
Right. You talk about these conservative revolutionaries, this cohort of thinkers in the interwar years in Europe to which Heidegger belonged. Let's drill down into that for a moment. What would be the difference between the so-called conservative revolutionaries and traditional conservatives or mainstream established conservatives?
Yeah, that's a good question. In addition, as one can see, lexically, the very term conservative revolutionary is a contradiction in terms. How can one be both a conservative and a revolutionary? This is a very important question to answer, because once the German monarchy, led by Wilhelm II in World War I, was cashiered in the course of the Versailles Treaty in the settlement in 1919, one might say that traditional German conservatism that aims to conserve or preserve past forms of political authority based on the monarchy and traditional powers in Germany, such as the Prussian Junkers who staffed the army, etc. The German right underwent a reconfiguration, and this is an incredibly important move in 20th century political thought, political theory, and politics itself. They decided that they needed to take a page from the vocabulary or lexicon of the political left. Namely, they needed to adopt the precepts of revolution going back to the Jacobins in the 1790s in France, and use them to their own advantage and apply them to current political circumstances. And for the most part, during the 1920s in Germany, the conservative revolutionaries were an intellectual movement and a movement of an intellectual elite. But they interestingly also tried to take credit for the rather anti-intellectual National Socialists once they seized political power in January 1933.
So let's talk about how the specific conservative revolutionary thought of Martin Heidegger has influenced some of the new right thinkers and writers you talk about in this chapter. Let's start with France, where you have the writer Alain de Benoit, who you call the éminence grise of the European new right. And someone he worked closely with over several decades, Dominique Venner, a founder of the far-right racist group Europe Action, who committed suicide spectacularly in front of 1,500 worshippers at the Notre Dame Cathedral in 2013.
Yeah, this is very important because there was a German precursor of the French New Right who was the German right-wing writer and militarist Ernst Jünger's secretary. The figure's name is Armin Moller, M-O-H-L-E-R, who, along with Alain de Benoist, helped conceive the program of the Nouvelle Droite or New Right in Europe during the 1960s. And Moller wrote a book that's actually recently been translated to English on the conservative revolution. And there are numerous people who believe that Moller basically invented the idea, even though the concept was coined in the 1920s. The whole program challenge of far-right politics and thought following World War II was, how does one rehabilitate, make acceptable once again, ideas that had been thoroughly discredited by the carnage and genocide of World War II. And their modus operandi, or their démarche, was to separate the so-called conservative revolutionaries, the figures we've been talking about, Heidegger, Schmidt, Ernst Jünger, Oswald Spengler, from Nazism. Okay, the Nazis were bad. They went too far with the Jewish thing, right? No, this is actually what you read among neo-fascists. But the conservative revolutionaries, now you can get a more exalted vocabulary, a more intellectually respectable vocabulary. And when one appropriates Heidegger's philosophy for these ends, along with the other figures I mentioned, one has the quote-unquote advantage of someone, a figure whose philosophy is often deemed to be the most significant breakthrough in phenomenology, in philosophy of mind, epistemology in the 20th century, the most significant philosopher, according to some, of the 20th century. And there comes, of course, a lot of intellectual prestige and cachet, and one can proceed from there to mask the vile, as Martin Jay said in the remarks he quoted, the rather vile politics that go along with it. So there's an important strategic aspect to the reception of the conservative revolutionary thinkers, including Heidegger, in the post-war period. That's been the project since the 1960s, since the formulation of, one might say, this French think tank that Alain de Benoist led. The acronym is GRES for Greece. Yes.
Now, in the German case, you focus on Mark Jungen, the deputy speaker of the far-right political party Alternative for Germany, or the AfD. And he's actually a member of the Bundestag, the German parliament, today. You also talk about Björn Höcke, a leader of the AfD's extreme Der Flügel faction, which the German government recently declared a right-wing extremist organization. One of the things that I learned from your chapter that intrigued me was that Mark Jungen did a PhD in philosophy under the supervision of Peter Sloterdijk, who is one of Germany's most influential philosophers and himself very influenced by Heidegger. So the Heidegger connections are all over this. These are not just sort of armchair intellectuals. These are people who have seats in the German parliament who are actually involved in political organizing.
That's right. So the lineage or the connections are much thicker and much more significant than would meet the eye. It's not just a question, if one looks at the details, armchair philosophers, university professors, reading groups, etc. There are specific think tanks located in Saxony in Germany, and a similar think tank in Vienna, Bavaria, that part of their project is to represent Heidegger's thought and its political value. And as you can see, yes, the case of Mark Jongen, who is known as the, in German you'd say Parteiphilosoph, that's the word they use, the party philosopher of the Alternative for Germany, which really isn't much of an alternative considering its ties to the conservative revolutionaries going back to the 20s and other far-right parties and organizations. This is, you know, it's quite an evolution in the rather traditional thinking of the German right in the post-war period after the discrediting of Nazism. But it's part of this plan. Just the German context has a specificity, namely they're interested in relativizing. This has been true since the so-called historians debate of the 1980s in which Habermas was involved. One of the key objectives is to relativize the Nazi past, to remove this opprobrium, veil of opprobrium from German history. And once their objective is, once this opprobrium is removed, then Germany can represent itself as a quote unquote normal nation. And of course, this frees their hand to reassume authoritarian political forms and ideas, as you can see with the AfD and its embrace of the folk idea and the hostility vis-a-vis immigration and foreigners in a modality that's very reminiscent of 1930s racism throughout Europe. So this is, and for 4 years, this AfD was the official, it's unimaginable. If one kind of goes back and imagines the trajectory of the Federal Republic of Germany, for 4 years, the AfD is the official opposition party in the Bundestag, or the German parliament. And they're still quite prominent.
Now, you say that among Heidegger's new right acolytes, the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugan occupies something of a unique place, in part because he's written the most of all of these thinkers we've discussed. He has written the most directly about Heidegger, multiple books. And he's also professed an explicit commitment to fascism. As you point out, many of the other new right thinkers sort of, you know, keep their distance from it or do this dance in which they disavow fascism proper. But Dugan didn't. He quite openly embraces it, although he's attenuated the fascism talk in more recent years. He is a belligerent advocate of Russian imperial conquest, what he calls neo-Eurasianism. And after Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, Dugan was dubbed Putin's brain, although the extent of his influence on Putin is debated. But there's no question that he's a leading intellectual figure, not only amongst Russian ultranationalists, but across Europe. So tell us about the case of Alexander Dugan and his Heideggerianism.
Yes. Dugan was extremely influential during the late 90s with a primer of geopolitics. He was a lecturer at the Academy of the Russian General Staff. And as one might recall, there was a lot of chaos in Russia during the 90s as the Soviet Union unraveled and collapsed, and the Russian Confederation suffered, from its own standpoint, these movements of independence of former of nations that had been attached to the Soviet Union or under Soviet hegemony. And there was always a search on the part of the Russian right, especially among the military, for a new ideology that could supplant communism. And Dugan's interest in fascism goes back to the early 1980s when he was a university student and ended up translating several right-wing thinkers who otherwise in Russia were relatively unknown. And Dugan these days, for obvious strategic reasons, he wants to downplay his discussions of fascism in the 1990s, and one has to imagine that might seem peculiar that he would have recourse to this lineage. But if one's growing up in the 1980s under a fairly moribund and octogenarian-led Soviet Union, it seemed for a certain contingent of intellectuals, quite marginal at the time, that fascism provided the best arguments against communism. So this accounts for Dugan's fascination with this lineage. And the more he received visibility in the 2000s with this doctrine of Neo-Eurasianism, in the 90s he co-founded a national Bolshevik party, which was during the 20s a group of German essentially conservative revolutionaries. Junger was affiliated with this movement that viewed commonalities between authoritarian commonalities between Russia, Soviet Union at the time, Bolshevism, and the German right as very important. So Dugan, as you correctly observe, has attempted to downplay many of his discussions of fascism in the 1990s for the sake of his move toward geopolitics or Eurasianism, to claim that Russia should be the hegemon. This is going back to Carl Schmitt's notion of Großraum or large space determinations of geopolitical domination or hegemony, a move away from international law and international treaties and international resolution of disputes to claims that are in fact very dangerous: regional hegemony by the most powerful state or political authority in the region. And there were similar arguments that Carl Schmitt made on behalf of Japan in the East and Nazi Germany in Central Europe in the late 1930s and 1940s.
Richard, I want to take a step back and ask about how this whole discussion of Heidegger's influence on the new right, how does this figure into your larger argument in the book about Heidegger's legacy? The winds have shifted in the debate, and that's largely because of the 2014 publication of Heidegger's Black Notebooks. What did that previously unpublished text reveal about Heidegger and his politics?
Yeah, that's quite important, because now we have a lot more data and information at our disposal about Heidegger's thought processes and the nature of his reflections on the relationship between politics and philosophy in the 1930s. And what we find in the Black Notebooks, for example, as Heidegger's defenders have pointed out, are many specific criticisms of the trajectory of National Socialism on the one hand, and on the other hand, Heidegger's continued hope that National Socialism would undergo a course correction and ultimately provide some kind of, he used these eschatological terms, redemption, salvation, etc., which was tied to his understanding of the history of being in the 1930s, that the only prospect for redemption from the decadence of Western civilization and the triumph of European nihilism, to use a Nietzschean figure, would be, as he called it, Deutschtum, or Germanness, that Germany, as the master of Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, they say, is the only hope for saving Europe from the abyss of technology and nihilism, etc. And what's quite striking and disappointing in Heidegger's case is that he never underwent a genuine learning process to tie the catastrophe of the Third Reich and Hitler's rule for 12 years from 1933 to 1945, and the tens of millions of deaths that resulted from Nazi militarism. He never made the link between the ideology of Nazism on the one hand and the European catastrophe that followed from it. He blamed the West. He blamed technology. The Holocaust was a product purely and simply of technology. It had nothing to do, in his view, with the German ideology, etc. So many of the reflections that he articulated in the Black Notebooks, even after the end of the war, he blamed the Allies, for example, during the occupation of Germany, for perpetrating crimes that were much worse than anything the Nazis had committed. He even observed at one point that the occupation of Germany and the process of re-education that the Allies undertook was a plot to prevent his own philosophy from blossoming and from reaching a German public. So some of these observations and reflections obviously are of an occasional off the cuff, offhand, let's say, nature. Their ultimate philosophical import is dubious. At the same time, one realizes quite clearly the parochialism of his worldview, and the parochialism in terms of he tended to see world history and contemporary politics exclusively from a, let's say, pan-German perspective, which has been a debility of German cultural nationalism, not in a monolithic way, but ever since the early 19th century and the wars of liberation, as they're called, against Napoleon, etc. It's been a feature, perhaps not the dominant tendency, but in Heidegger, he never extricated himself from the narrow-mindedness and deformations, one might say, of this view of the world.
Getting back to the question of the new right, what would you say to those who might push back and say, or ask if responsibility for these nefarious political agendas of the new right, can they really be laid at Heidegger's doorstep? I mean, he died in 1976 and isn't alive to defend himself. The ideas of all kinds of thinkers have been put to pernicious ends, especially after their death. There are left Heideggerians. There have even been attempts to synthesize Heidegger and Marx. So aren't there different ways to interpret Heidegger's ideas beyond just the new right?
Yeah, I think this is a fair question and a good question. And let me clarify that I really don't make an attempt to attribute any kind of intellectual responsibility for the contemporary new right to Heidegger per se. There's a plurality, as I tried to indicate earlier, of conservative revolutionary thinkers who've informed this worldview and play a key role in a global setting at present. But I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that one can make these connections, and the many ideological proponents of the new right have, between aspects of Heidegger's thinking and the attempt today to implant some form of authoritarian national populism, and perhaps something even worse, something that politically does resemble historical fascism in a contemporary context, in the context of 21st century politics. So rather than sweep such considerations under the rug, I mean, for example, just to bring this aspect of Heidegger's influence and reception to close. Some of Heidegger's defenders claim that this isn't like what this happened with Nietzsche, for example, with the Nietzsche reception by the Nazis. Nietzsche's defenders have always claimed, and of course they have a point, that this is an inauthentic and misreading of Nietzsche. Well, but why are they reading Nietzsche, and why do they try to make these rapprochements with Nietzsche's thought? So it's a question of both and rather than either or. But in Heidegger's case, too, why go to Heidegger? Why rely on Heidegger, which only says that there are aspects of Heidegger's thought that are serviceable for these illiberal and anti-democratic political ends. And if it's okay, I'll just move on to this other important issue you raise of the phenomenon of left Heideggerianism. And you've kind of caught me here. You're right that in the case of Marcuse, John Abramite and I edited this anthology 12 years ago or so called Heideggerian Marxism. But Marcuse is one case, and he quickly gave up on this paradigm and wrote quite critically about Heidegger's, the political implications of Heidegger's thought, the ideological implications during the early 1930s, when things became clearer. He began to, so to speak, put two and two together, and could in retrospect see the connections that were significant. But this issue of left Heideggerianism, I think, is important, especially in terms of Derrida's influence and the influence of his some of his followers, such as Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and Jean-Luc Nancy, etc., whose thinking has been quite influential in comparative literature circles and certain aspects of philosophy. This is, one can legitimately question, I think. You mentioned Foucault as well, whether or not this approach to modernity and democracy is genuinely of the left. And this is a complicated issue, but let me just point out to one aspect of their thinking that one needs to examine more closely to come to some kind of conclusion about the political valences of their philosophy and metapolitics, and that has to do with their acceptance of the, I would call it, critique of civilization. That's a English translation of this German phrase, Zivilisationskritik. And this has to do with the Nietzschean trope I mentioned earlier of European nihilism. And it manifests itself in Heidegger's Being in Time, this critique of Western civilization as the apogee of European nihilism. It has no redemptive features. It must be destroyed in order to be reborn. One has a similar sweeping critique of liberalism, democracy, all these figures that I mentioned earlier on in the hour of reason, individualism, etc. There was a great polemical indictment, especially after the Versailles Treaty, and blaming the West for Germany having lost its African colonies and being saddled with this republic. Of course, it was Germans who proclaimed the Weimar Republic in November 1918. This was nothing that was foisted on them per se. Be that as it may, so to get back to your question, one of my concerns is that the paradigm of quote-unquote left Heideggerianism has accepted, by relying on figures like Heidegger extensively, Agamben too, you mentioned, Heidegger, Carl Schmitt is also very prominent among these thinkers. The whole, and Nietzsche, needless to say, is really the kind of the guru for the conservative revolutionaries in the 20s, but also very much, as one knows, in the case of the so-called, for French theory, in left Heideggerianism. So I feel that the ready acceptance of this paradigm of Nietzschean nihilism, this indictment of the West in so many aspects, it's not, to make a simple point, it's not an immanent critique. It's not a partial critique that attempts to preserve aspects of democracy and the Enlightenment vis-a-vis other aspects that we should abandon or criticize mercilessly. It's a total critique. a la Nietzsche. Of course, there are other aspects of Nietzsche that certainly one can appreciate. But this ideological aspect, I fear, has been continued and valued by the paradigm, if one can speak so generally, of left Heideggerianism. And there's a phrase in French political thinking that applied very much during the 30s, when there were many political figures on the left. Mussolini back in the 1910s during World War I was the paradigm, switching from the Socialist Party to forming after the war the National Fascist Party in Italy. We know where that ended up. There was a similar phenomenon in the 30s where many figures on the left in Europe decided that if they wanted to achieve socialism, attain the goals of socialism, they came to the same conclusion that Nietzsche came to that Mussolini came to during World War I, that if one really wanted to realize the goals of socialism, it had to be a national socialism, small n, small s, not international socialism. So there were many European intellectuals prominent figures too, who followed the Mussolini path. And I would just ask if under the cover of being quote unquote left Heideggerians, there isn't a good part of right Heideggerianism that goes along with it. And I think many of the defenders of this perspective have been a bit naive and not as straightforward as they might be concerning the problematic ideological components of this standpoint or perspective.
I'd like to conclude by asking you about an essay you've written on the Great Replacement theory and its European origins that you published in August in the Los Angeles Review of Books. It also comes up in your book in the chapter on Heidegger and the New Right, this obsession, this recurring motif of populations and migrants and belonging, who belongs and who doesn't, and the fate of the white European population of the various countries in question. The Great Replacement theory has been popularized in all kinds of ways by the likes of Tucker Carlson and very much mainstreamed and normalized and sanitized. So take us back to the origins of this Great Replacement theory, Richard.
One can really begin to trace the fears of foreign inundation at the time of the Dreyfus Affair in France, where some of these phrases were first used of population replacement on the part of the anti-Dreyfusards. And at the time, it was, of course, used to anti-Semitism in France at the time was quite rife, perhaps at the same level it was at in Germany at the time. So there was a fear that France, its national character was being transformed by immigrants from Eastern Europe who could never be authentically French. And this is an interesting turning point in the history of European nationalism, where nationalism earlier on had been a civic nationalism, had been based on conceptions of citizenship and the rights of birth or jus soli, as it's called in international law, a turning point to ethnic nationalism, that being French had to do, it wasn't quite racial, but it had to do with attachment to soil and land and heritage and language. And one couldn't be really a naturalized citizen. This was a contradiction in terms, which is very much against the tradition of civic nationalism. And a similar mentality kicked in the 1930s during the crisis after the Great Depression, but also it was prominent during the era of decolonization in conjunction with the Algerian War in France, which ended in 1962 with Algerian independence, but also precipitated a virtual civil war within France among those who wanted to keep Algeria French and those who were in favor of an independent Algeria. It tore France in two, and continues to be a sore point in French politics, and working through the torture and the level of crimes that the French military perpetrated in Algeria. At the time of decolonization, when many former residents of the colonial nations began immigrating to France and to Europe, it was the new right who took up this cudgel and began using the phrase population replacement to in favor of the idea of an Aryan or white nationalist Europe, a rigorously anti-immigrant ideology that was quite widespread at the time, and of course again in recent years, as you indicate, has been reborn in rather insidious ways.
It's been reborn, and speaking of North Africa, it's on terrifying full display in Tunisia today, where the country's president, Kais Saied, has unleashed a paroxysm of violence targeting Black migrants, inspired by a local version of the Great Replacement theory that he himself articulated in his speech. And, the ironies abound because, of course, it's North Africans in Europe who are usually targeted as the invaders. But in this case, it's North Africans saying that sub-Saharan Black Africans are invading their lands. But without getting into the details of the Tunisian case, the point is that 2 points. One is that political violence, as you say in the book, words have consequences. Ideas, like the new rights, have consequences in the real world. And secondly, this particular narrative, this conspiratorial fantasy of the Great Replacement, is actually traveling. It's globalizing, it's spreading. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, this is interesting that you point out Said's use. I believe it began in a speech he gave in February, denouncing sub-Saharan Africans and migrants from places such as Nigeria or West Africa, who have in many cases taken up jobs that native Tunisians feel are beneath them. There's a parallel phenomenon in Europe and North America as well, of course, in terms of the logics of migration. It's a maneuver or a chess move made out of desperation, since there have been many protests against his authoritarian rule. It's a rather sad case. You know more about this than I do, Danny, since you follow Middle Eastern politics quite closely. It's very sad, since Tunisia had been the one success story in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And 19 months ago, Said transformed the constitution so what's especially regrettable, of course, is that the politicians in North Africa, such as Said, are imitating our mistakes. That is, the mistakes that the West has made, undergoing a type of urbanization to see if this ideological denigration of an immigrant population can serve as and conspiracy theory can serve as a vehicle of unity to get the Tunisian people to rally behind them. Of course, the crimes perpetrated against sub-Saharan Africans have been fearful, and are reminiscent of the worst kinds of ethnic persecutions one can imagine that are going on in the world today. And it's so one would hope that politicians in the developing world might be learning other lessons from European politics and European political history, but the way ahead instead has been paved, it seems, by figures like Viktor Orban and others who are irresponsibly bandying about this conspiracy about population replacement, knowing all the while that it's a lie, it's a falsification, and it's which makes it, which bespeaks its ideological political function.
Richard, thanks so much for joining us on The Lead.
Thank you very much, Danny, for having me, and enjoyed our conversation.
This has been The Lead by New Lines Magazine. You can buy Richard Wolin's book, Heidegger in Ruins, at all good bookshops. This week's episode was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Danny Postel. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.